Hello, it's good to be with you again on our Wednesday night study and devotional. We're going to be making some changes soon. We're going to still have services this coming Sunday as we have the previous two. The state officially goes to phase 3 on June the 1st, and at that time we'll be making some changes, and we will let you know this through Facebook and other means, so be watching for that. We're going to be continuing our study of Peter tonight. We're going to be looking in the Gospel of Mark about Peter. Mark is a very interesting gospel. It's the shortest of the 4 Gospels. And just some things to notice about what Mark writes and how he writes. There's one particular thing of interest to me, and that is that Mark seems to kind of keep you on a dead run when you're reading through the book of Mark. If you read through it and you got this impression that Mark's in a hurry, you're not alone. I did a word count on the word "and" in Mark compared to Matthew and Luke and John. Now, that's a detailed study, I assure you, but I can tell you that Mark uses the word "and" considerably more times per word in his gospel account. He also uses another word that's quite interesting. In the King James, it's the word straightway. In the New American Standard, it's the word immediately. John will write about things that happened that other gospel writers just simply say, and this took place or this happened. And Mark's different because he will say, it happened immediately. And so that word immediately is used 19 times by Mark. And 17 of those times take place between chapter 1 and chapter 11, verse 3 and 4. Now, what happens in this is that after Mark 11:3, there are only 2 times when the word immediately takes place. One of those times is when it's used by, or in reference to Judas in one of his actions. The second time is in reference to the Jewish council immediately making the determination to try to arrest Jesus. Both of those were enemies of Jesus, both of those against what he was doing. The rest of the time, it's kind of like Mark is saying immediately, kind of in ways of trying to make things happen faster. And so we're on a dead run. We're using the word "and." It's like listening to a 3-year-old describe his vacation. And we got in the car, and we went to town, and we stopped, and you know how they are. But at any rate, there's one thing that happens in chapter 11, and that is up until this time, Mark starts with the beginning of the gospel, the calling of the disciples. He kind of hits the ground running with Jesus. He doesn't spend any time talking about the birth of Jesus, what happened before then. He doesn't do any of that. But he seems to be in a hurry to get somewhere with Jesus. And what happens in chapter 11 is that Jesus arrives in Jerusalem for the final week of his life. This is when he's going to be making the sacrifice on the cross. This is when he dies, when he's resurrected from the dead. And so Mark just seems to be in a hurry to get us to that point. He's telling us some other stories, and they're exciting stories. He tells them in an exciting way. But Mark's main reason is to get us to Jerusalem. And then when you're reading Mark 11, verse 3, after that point, it's kind of like you've been trying to keep up with somebody, and they finally slow down, and they start talking a little bit slower, and they give you more details about things. And that's exactly what Mark does here. He's got us to Jerusalem. Now he's going to take his time. And now, after that, the only people who seem to be in a hurry are the enemies of Jesus, trying to get rid of Jesus. Now, John Mark has some very unique things about it. And the things that he's written have caused some people to believe that John Mark wrote his gospel account with a lot of help from the Apostle Peter. As a matter of fact, there is a commentary that was written back in the 1800s that said that the Gospel of Mark has long been regarded as the memoirs of Peter. You might say, well, why is that? And that's going to be a good part of our study this evening. First of all, when you start off with Mark chapter 1, verse 6, Mark's going to tell us about John the Baptist. And he's going to give us some details, personal details about how John dresses, what he eats. We're told that John was clothed with camel's hair. He wore a leather belt around his waist. His diet was locusts and wild honey. This is an indication of somebody who knew John and was with John. And of course, we know the Apostle Peter had been with John and was one of his disciples. And so he would notice details like that some other writers might leave out if they were not actually with John. That's not enough to give us a reason for saying that we think Peter had a lot to do with this. But at any rate, we find out in chapter 1 again, verses 29 through 31. Jesus and his disciples have come to the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now, at first, in some of the other gospel writings, Andrew's mentioned first, because Andrew's the one that first heard about Jesus and then went and found Peter and brought him to Jesus. But Mark's a little different in that, because when it mentions Andrew and Simon, it mentions Simon first. And that would be common for someone who's getting their information from a Simon in this case. But in verses 29 through 31, we find Jesus at the home of Andrew and Simon, or Simon and Andrew as is written here, and Simon's mother-in-law is sick with a fever. Mark's the only gospel writer that tells us this particular story about her being sick and Jesus healing her from her illness, and then she gets up and waits on them. The other gospel writers don't do that, so that's another unique thing about Mark. And Mark is a lot like the other gospel writers in other ways, but not in this way. If you go to Mark chapter 6 now, there's a story that's told, and Matthew goes into greater detail than Mark does, but in chapter 6, verses 47 through 51, we have the account of Jesus walking on water. And of course, if you've read Matthew's account, you know that Jesus wasn't the only one who walked on water. As a matter of fact, Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you." And Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked to Jesus on water. But when you read Mark's account in Mark chapter 6, Mark leaves that out. He has Jesus walking on the water. He has the disciples thinking that it's a ghost. And then he has, in verse 51, Jesus getting into the boat with them. Totally leaves out the story of Peter walking on water. You know, if some kid walked on water, he would want to tell that story. He'd want to tell it in great detail, what it felt like, what it looked like. But leaving the story out is actually an indication that Peter had a hand in this story. Because of his humility at that point in life when this was written, Peter glosses over that. He does not want to bring a lot of attention to himself and maybe take something away from Jesus. And if that is the reason why this is omitted, then it makes perfect sense that Peter would not really care that that part of it was told about. In chapter 8, verses 27 through 30, we have the account where Jesus said, "Who do men say that I am? And then, who do you say that I am?" And Mark tells us that Peter answered, "You are the Christ." And the very next verse is, Jesus warned them to not tell anyone about him. Now, if you're familiar with Matthew's account, Matthew goes into a lot greater detail here. He talks about Jesus telling Peter he's blessed because flesh and blood did not reveal this to him, but his Father who's in heaven. He tells him he's going to be given the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever he binds on earth should be bound in heaven, whatever he looses on earth should be loosed in heaven. He tells him that, he just makes a special deal, but you're Peter. Upon this rock I'll build my church. That's all left out in Mark's account. And again, once more, it's a sign of an humble individual not wanting the story about him to detract from the story about Jesus. Not to say that it's not important, but perhaps he knew that Matthew's already covered this, and in his humility, he would rather this not be in there. What he does include, right after that, at the beginning of verse 31, is when Jesus had told him about his impending death, that Peter rebukes Jesus. And at any rate, Peter takes him aside and rebukes him. Matthew tells us that Peter said, Lord, God forbid this should ever happen to you. It shall not happen. But Mark tells us that after that time when Peter rebuked Jesus, Jesus looked at the disciples. And when he saw them, he then tells Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are not setting your mind on God's interest, but man's. Jesus looked at the other disciples and he saw the effect Peter's words were having on them, and he could not let that stand that way. So Jesus has to rebuke Peter, and that is included in Mark's account, Peter getting rebuked. Now, if you move from there, you can go on to chapter 11. In chapter 11 at verse 21, we'll look at this after I get to chapter 11. Jesus had been walking along to Jerusalem. He saw a fig tree. It had leaves. Now, we're told that this was not the season for figs, but the fig tree had leaves, and when in that part of the world, when a fig tree has leaves, it's basically advertising, I've got figs. So Jesus goes up to it looking for figs, but there's no figs on it. It's not season, even though the fig tree's advertising that it's got it. He places a curse upon it. And then later they come back by and they see this fig tree withered from the roots up. In the other accounts, the disciples say, Lord, look at the tree, how quickly it's withered. Mark tells us, and this is a little detail, that it is Peter who talked to Jesus, and it was Peter who said, Rabbi, behold, the fig tree which you cursed has withered. So a little bit of a detail there that the other writers didn't necessarily think about who said it, but since Peter's telling the story, if we're right about Peter helping John Mark, then Peter's going to say, I told the Lord, look at this, the fig tree. And so that would indicate, once again, a reason why we support the idea that Peter had a lot to do with the writing of the Gospel of Mark. Now, if you want to go to chapter 14 now, and we're moving rather quickly here because mainly we're wanting to look at events where Peter is singled out in the Gospel of Mark. Now, in the other accounts, some of the other accounts, Jesus had gone into the Garden of Gethsemane. He left the disciples behind in the entrance, near the entrance of the garden. He takes Peter, James, and John farther into the garden itself, and then he tells them to pray and to watch while he goes to pray. And he goes about a stone's throw away from them. He falls on his face. He begins to pray earnestly for about an hour. And he comes back, and when he comes back, he found them sleeping. Now, the other writers tell us that he said to Peter, can't you guys stay awake? John Mark's account differs just slightly in this point, because he will give a little detail here that when Jesus came to them, he said, Simon, are you asleep? You know, could you not keep watch for 1 hour? So he's singling out Peter. And, you know, if you are one of the disciples that gets singled out at a time like this when Jesus is relying on you and all of a sudden you find out you're unreliable, then you're going to remember that. That's going to sting. And I think Peter wanted that little bit of information to be passed on. Later in that same chapter, in verse 47, Jesus is being arrested, and one of the disciples, Mark tells us, a certain one, drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Peter's not mentioned here. Perhaps it's because Peter doesn't want to be seen as a would-be hero in this matter. He doesn't want to be singled out as the one brave one who would draw out a sword. Now, that could be just another sign of humility. That could be just coincidence that John Mark does not mention it, whereas some of the others do mention it, because not every gospel writer included every single detail. But at any rate, that's kind of the end, almost the end of the specifics about Mark's account. To keep this in order, we're going to go to chapter 14, verse 51. John Mark's the only one that's going to tell us this particular story. It's a very brief one. Jesus is being led away. He's been arrested. And we're told that a certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body, and they seized him, but he left the linen sheet behind and escaped naked. The presumption here is that this is a young man who heard something going on. Maybe he heard the mob of soldiers and Jewish leaders going through the city, and he got out of bed with nothing on, so he just wrapped a sheet around himself to go find out what's going on. And when he saw that it was Jesus they were leading away, he began to follow. And they tried to stop him, perhaps wanting to make sure that this was not someone else they needed to arrest. But at any rate, he escaped only by leaving the linen blanket in their hands. There is some speculation that this person was John Mark. I really know of no good reason to include this story except that it's an odd thing that happened, unless the person telling the story was the person who was in the story. And that's a very good possibility there. There are other speculations in chapter 16, verse 5, that the young man that's seen in the tomb, and there are differing accounts about who's seen in the tomb. Was it one person, a young man in Mark's account here? Was it angels? Two angels, one at the foot, one at the head of Jesus. It's very likely that in chapter 16, verse 5, this was not John Mark or any other average person, but indeed was an angel. But when you take what was said and compare it to the other gospel accounts, but I mention it because some people will suggest that this also was John Mark. We don't know that, and that's fairly unlikely. One last time that Peter's mentioned, and it's unique in Mark's account, is in chapter 16, verse 7. When this young man is telling the others about what's going on, in verse 6, and I believe this is probably an angel of God, in verse 6, he said to them, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He has risen. He is not here. Behold, here is the place where they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter, he's going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he said to you." Now, the other accounts tell us that they were told to go into Galilee. The disciples were told this, but Matthew tells us this, but Matthew doesn't include the words "and Peter." Now, this, I believe that the "and Peter" was part of what was said, and Matthew just doesn't include it. Mark includes it, however, and if you and I were Peter, this would mean so much to us, because I want you to think about it. Peter has denied Jesus 3 times the night that Jesus was captured, was being interrogated, being tried. And he said 3 different times, "I don't know him." And he's tortured himself, I'm sure, ever since that time till this day when Jesus is raised from the dead. And the very special message pertains to him, because Peter is the only one that denied him 3 times. The others ran away, and Peter ended up running away as well. But Peter needs to know and hear this, that Jesus called him by name, that Jesus wants him to be a part of this still yet. At any rate, if you found some other things unique about Peter's role in the Gospel of Mark, I would like for you to share those with me. I can't catch everything. I do try to catch as much as I can. But at any rate, I hope you enjoyed this part of the study of Peter. After this, we're going to spend a little bit of time on other details about Peter. We may have to put that off a little bit because as things stand right now, we are planning to restart our summer series. Well, I guess start it. We haven't started it yet. But our plans are to start it, and if that's the case, this Wednesday night study will be replaced by our summer series speakers. At any rate, I hope you enjoyed this and have one little bit of a short devotional message to leave with you. How many of you have noticed the government, political leaders talking about essential businesses and non-essential businesses? Isn't it interesting that they're giving their definitions of what's essential and what is non-essential? I find it rather insulting that a store that sells intoxicating beverages is essential to our nation, but churches which tell about the salvation of the soul and preach God's word are not essential. I think that's a slap in the face of everything that's holy and right. But we have no control over that. Someone asked me, why is it that liquor stores and pot stores were deemed essential, but not churches? And I said, well, perhaps the typical politician would be thinking, which am I going to miss? Am I going to miss church? Probably not. Liquor stores? Oh, yeah. So we'll make those essential. I'm just joking with you a little bit there. And then again, maybe I'm not joking. But at any rate, we know that difference. And we know the difference between non-essential and essential personnel. Interesting thing about that to me is that those people who are making the big bucks in life, the star athletes in all the sports, they were essentially told they're non-essential, that we can get along without you. And the people that are making the least amount of money for their livelihood, the police, the health workers, ones like that, they have been deemed essential. We're finally recognizing that they're the people we really need in life, even though we're not paying them like we pay the athletes. At any rate, have you ever wondered, am I essential or am I non-essential? Not in the sense of to our government or to our state or community, but what about to God? Are you essential or are you non-essential? When 1 Corinthians chapter 12, the Apostle Paul compares individual Christians to parts of the body. And he tells us, the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. Or again, the head to the feet, saying, I have no need of you. Now, we give a lot of attention to our eyes, don't we? We give a lot of attention to our head, our appearance. Our feet, we put some socks and shoes on and we forget about them. Our hands, maybe we'll put some lotion if they're bothering us, but pretty much we don't think about our hands. We don't show them off. Nobody says, oh, you have some handsome hands there. Nobody ever told me my toes were pretty. So we don't really think of those as highly as other parts of the body. And yet Paul says it is true that the members of the body that seem to be weaker are necessary. You know, and other members of the body that we deem less honorable, and these we bestow more honor, abundant honor, and our unseemly members come to have more abundant seemliness. In other words, that head can't go anywhere unless the feet take them. And those eyes are helpless without the hand to do what the eye sees that needs to be done. And the application is that in the Lord's body, we are all different parts of the body. We serve different purposes in the body, but we are all essential in God's eyes. We are all essential to each other. We have so many different members of the church here in Newalla who do wonderful things, and I would hate to be without them for even a moment. People who are working behind the scenes, taking care of things, and I may be in the spotlight. I may be the one most noticed. But I tell you this, the average church member here is doing a lot of work, a lot more work than anyone realizes. And all of you, you might say, well, I can't get out and do this or that. You're still important. There are parts of our body that are operating and working, and we never even think about it, but they are there, and we notice it if they suddenly quit. And we would hate to miss anyone here, and we would notice it certainly if anyone quit. You are essential to God. You are essential and important to us. You are deserving of God's honor. And I want to tell you something I really expect to happen on the day of judgment. When, Jesus had told James and John, it's not mine to give the left hand and right hand places of honor. It's up to God. I wonder who might occupy those places. I think a lot of people in the church would be surprised that it might be someone they hardly ever noticed, but God noticed. Brethren, you're essential. You're important to God, and never let anyone tell you otherwise. May God bless you, and we hope to see you on Sunday.